Friends, welcome to another episode. For 3 weekends, including this weekend, we are going to hear from the Gospel of John. In reality, it's 4 weekends if we include our reading from John the last weekend where we heard about the multiplication of loaves. Now, the reason this is significant is because really, liturgically, we're supposed to be reading from the Gospel of Mark. But then the church sets aside the Gospel of Mark and for 4 weekends reflects on John chapter 6, which for us in the Catholic tradition, we call it the bread of life discourse. And when the church does that, I think what she's really trying to say is that this discourse, the bread of life discourse, is so important to the church, that the Eucharist, that the Mass is so important to the church, that it's worth taking 4 weeks to reflect upon it deeply, because the Eucharist is the center of our worship, isn't it? The Eucharist is really, as Vatican II would say, the source and summit of all our worship. In fact, the Eucharist is the source and summit of our Christian life. And so we take 4 weeks to reflect on the bread of life discourse. So please follow this episode for the next 3 weekends, because I'm going to deal with the various aspects of the bread of life discourse. Today, I merely want to deal in 5 minutes. I really want to deal with one aspect of Jesus' teaching where he tells his disciples, he says, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never hunger. Whoever believes in me will never thirst. In another place, Jesus also says that he who eats this bread and drinks this blood will live forever. Jesus also says another very significant statement. He says, do not work for the food that perishes, but actually work for the bread of life. Now, some of these things can really be misunderstood. For example, even though we participate in the Eucharist, we eat of that bread and we drink from the cup, we still get hungry, we still get thirsty, physically, we still will die, and we really do work for the food that perishes, because food and drink, gosh, these are our basic needs along with shelter. We would not survive if we did not work for food and for drink and for our shelter. So what is Jesus really saying? Is he really saying that these physical realities are not important? So I want to just spend a few minutes thinking about what Jesus really means by the words that he spoke, especially do not work for food that perishes. In the Christian tradition, the human body is very important. So I guess I'm trying to say that Jesus did not mean that we should not take care of our physical bodies. In fact, our bodies are God's gifts. We have to nourish our body. We have to take care of our body. We also believe in the resurrection of the dead, which means that one day our bodies will rise to welcome Jesus when he comes in his eternal glory. So I don't think Jesus is really saying that we should not care about our physical selves. Now, as human beings, we spend a lot of time, energy, and resources in making sure that our basic needs are met, isn't it? In fact, think about how much time we spend on making sure that we can make a livelihood. From the time that we are kids, we go to school for an education. And then we not only get basic education, we try to get good education so that we can make a decent living, that we can be comfortable in our lives and provide for our families. Is Jesus against all that? No. I think the real meaning of what Jesus is saying, especially when he says, do not work for food that perishes, is simply this. I think Christ is telling us that as eager as we are to provide for our basic necessities, that eager, if not even more eager, we should be about trying to fulfill God's will. In other words, we have to ask ourselves this question: why did God give me this body? Why did God give me my spirit, my mind, my soul? Why did God send me on the face of the earth? Why was I created by God? What's the purpose? There is a purpose, right? We have a lifetime to figure what that purpose is. Now, there are many people who don't think about that deeper meaning. All they do is work for our physical basic existence. In fact, they go beyond taking care of their physical existence. Sometimes they focus too much on themselves so that they become selfish people. People who do not care about others. People who only care about themselves. Jesus at one time, especially when he was in the desert, tempted by the devil to transform stone into bread, Jesus says, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. At another place, especially in John chapter 4, where Jesus had just met with a Samaritan woman, the disciples bring him food to eat and they say, Master, eat. And Jesus says, my food is to do the will of the one who sent me. And that is the deeper meaning of Jesus saying, do not work for food that perishes. He's not saying do not take care of your physical necessities, of your basic needs. What Jesus is saying is that as hard as we work towards fulfilling our basic needs, we should be working that hard to do God's will on earth. Folks, we might make a lot of money, we might live a very good life, but if on the last day we stand before God and we are empty-handed because we did not do what God sent us for, that would be a tragedy. And Jesus is saying, yes, your basic needs are important, but it's also that important to make sure that on the last day you stand before God and you look at God and say, dear God, you gave me this life and you accomplished what you sent me for. That is the meaning of really saying, do not work for food that perishes. What will take us to eternity is not necessarily food that perishes. Food that perishes helps us to accomplish for the food that does not perish, and that is Jesus Christ, the bread of life. May the bread of life fulfill our hunger and our thirst for meaning and purpose. And one day, may we stand before God accomplishing everything that God sent us for. Have a great weekend.